Hey guys, TommyBryson here, and this video is about why exactly do I live the way I live, And for a lot of people, if you live with me for a day or a week, you might say, Tommy, you live like a poor man. And the answer is I do. I really do. And the reason is in this video, and I'm going to break everything down in a practical way and also the way I think and my approach. And this video is going to be long, not long for the sake of the algorithm and making money, and not long for the sake of me just wanting to keep talking, but because some topics I really want to go deep so this way you can actually understand the way I actually think. Now, here's something. I cannot promise you that this video is going to be worthwhile for you. But I do believe that the people that this video is worthwhile for and actually are able to actually get it and understand it, maybe grab the whole idea by the end of this video, it'll actually change the way you think forever. Because a lot of this stuff I did not know, and when I knew, it changed me radically. Now, obviously, I'm a Christian, and the gospel and understanding a lot of things about the faith changed me in a lot of ways. But as you guys know, before I became a Christian, I had read over 200 books on finance and on money. So I do have a lot of experience when it comes to, getting more money, having success, and all these things. And then all of a sudden, fast forward to today, I'm like a whole different person, right? So it's important to understand where that comes from and why. So I want to share with you guys a story that I actually love a lot, that I just realized like yesterday that I started to live my life like, okay? And I read the story years ago, and I was like, cool story. Yeah, it's true. But I had no intention in actually fulfilling that story and its message. So here's a story, and I want to share with you guys right now, okay? It's the story about the Harvard businessman or graduate and the poor Mexican fisher. Now, here it is, okay? On his well-earned holiday, a Harvard business graduate watched how a small fishing boat approached the harbor in a small coastal Mexican village. Now, automatically, you have this guy from Harvard. He's basically on vacation. He earned it. A guy's coming by, okay? Mexican guy in a coastal Mexican village. He's coming by. Now, what's happening here, okay? It was still late morning, but the boat was full of fish. So he asked how long did it take him to actually catch them, okay? And by the way, late morning basically means like 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., not afternoon yet. And all of a sudden, this guy basically had a boat full of fish, and he basically said, hey, it took me a few hours. What are you going to do now? The guy asks him, okay? He says, the usual. I'm going to play around with my kids. I'm going to have some quality time with my wife during the siesta. I'm going to scroll around the village and basically hang out with my friends, my amigos, drink some wine, and play my guitar. So it sounds like I do some work now, and I get to spend the rest of my time with my family and my friends and just having some enjoyment. Now, upon hearing this, the successful businessman knew that he could help the poor fellow, basically saying, I can help this person, okay? Or at least he thought so. And he says, I'm a Harvard business graduate. If you follow my advice, you could change your life, okay? Okay, great. Now, what do you mean, he asks, okay? With that amount of fishing, you can support your current lifestyle, right? Yes. Quite much, he says. Now, basically saying, if I work this much, I can support my life and continue living the way I live. And he seems to have a pretty good life. Then, if you would work also the afternoons as the business guy, you could use to gain extra money for investing. Soon, you could buy another boat and hire some guys to run it. Your revenues would increase again, and soon you would be operating a fleet of fishing boats. And then he asks, and then what I would do, okay? So basically saying the businessman found a gap. He has more time. You could use that time to make more money, to build a fleet of fishing boats. A fleet means multiple boats, okay? And then the guy basically says, and then what would I do after I have that, okay? He says, then you could leave the fishing to the others and concentrate on the business part. You could cut out the middleman by selling directly to American distributors. However, you would of course have to relocate to Los Angeles or New York, but that would be necessary sacrifice for the success that awaits you. Basically saying, hey, everything would have changed. You would have more work to do, but it's going to be worth it because you're going to be successful. And you'll have to change locations. You'll go to Los Angeles or New York, foreign countries, but it's going to be worth it. And he says, and then what? Notice here, it keeps going further. And it's very important when you're asking yourself questions, always ask why. Why? And then what? And then what? And then what? Okay? Those are very important because they kind of get to the soul of what's actually going on. Then he says, by working hard, you could be a millionaire in 20 or so years. And then what? Then comes the best part, he says. By the way, look at this, okay? 20 years to accomplish this goal. Then comes the best part. You would sell it all, cash in the money, and retire into a small coastal fishing village where you could just play around with your kids, have some quality time with your wife, scroll around the village in the evening and hang out with your friends, drinking some wine and playing your guitar. Now, obviously, the meaning here is right there. It's almost like saying a lot of folks, they go through a life of hardship and a lot of crazy work to accomplish something they can do right now. And this poor guy in Mexico doing his daily fishing, he already had those things. You know what else he had? That he wouldn't have if he actually went through all that stuff, right? 20 years would pass for him to become a millionaire in this example. And, he would have a lot of money, then sell it all, then be able to retire. But by that point, his kids are not kids. They're men and grown women, His wife is not as vibrant as she used to be because old age has also caught up to her, okay? And also to him, right? So it's a lot more different. And that story changed my life forever because it put things into perspective. And when I read this story for the first time, which was basically in a book I read a long time ago, it didn't really hit me. I was like, so cool, people can just do this, maybe made a video about it, whatever. But now, when I read this story, I was in New York. I was probably working like over 60 hours a week potentially. I had a full-blown business. I had little time to go on vacation. And my focus was on making the most money possible. And I was making a lot of money. And the whole goal was to work and work and work so I could eventually not have to work as much. Now today, fast forward a few years later, I don't make as much money as I did back then. However, I made some smart investments, which is great stuff. But I live in Dominican Republic, in a town where people are not really wealthy, where my family is, where my church is. I get to spend time with my friends. I get to work some during the day, maybe like 4 hours or something like that, okay? And I have enjoyment out of life a lot more than I ever did. And I could say, I could have more money to buy maybe a fancy car and a fancy house, but does that really matter? The answer is, it doesn't. And whenever I pictured retirement, honestly, I never pictured this retirement in the sense that when I pictured retirement back then, when I was working so hard, it was basically, I'm going to have a house, big house. I'm going to have a car, nice car, I'm going to have this and that, and you don't really realize what the cost is. It's years and years and years. And you say, well, it's going to be worth it. No, it probably won't be. And these days, I live a much better life in a way. Now, let's get to the practical stuff because it's not just about this story that this video is about, but I really want to share with you guys because it's a very important story. And if you actually grasp it, it could actually help you a lot, okay? Now, here's the first part, guys, okay? Now, for me to actually be able to live the way I live and to basically say, I'm going to work this much to sustain the lifestyle that I have now and not be so worried about, everything else. I had to actually take a look at my needs and what my needs actually are. Now, I had the blessing that I basically grew up and live in a third world country, basically saying I know what real needs actually are. And I'm not telling you to go out there and live like you're homeless and live like you don't have anything because it's not what I'm telling you. I'm not telling you to be a nomad or whatever. But I am telling you that there are certain needs in life. You have shelter. You don't need a house with more bedrooms than bathrooms. I remember more bathrooms than bedrooms. I remember my grandma, she had 10 kids. And I think not one passed away, and she had like 9 that actually lived with her, and they had like 2 to 3 bedrooms, basically saying they had more beds than they had rooms, and everyone grew up just fine. Now, am I telling you that it's a bad thing to buy a crazy expensive house? The answer is no. But if you can't afford it, and if for you to actually be able to afford it is going to cost you decades of your life, really consider what you're actually saying. I'd rather have 3 kids in 1 bedroom than have 3 kids in 3 separate bedrooms and 20 years of work to be able to make that happen. Because what is going to make my kids happy? Is it going to be having time with their father or having 3 bedrooms separately? Okay? See what I'm saying here? Now, you also have, for example, utilities, for example, gas and electricity and water. In a lot of places in the world, believe it or not, you don't have running water and you don't have also consistent electricity. Although those are things we all pay for, but it's also understanding that everything else, like, your cable bill, your internet bill, your phone bill, all those things, although you might think they're necessities, they're not. They're wants. And when I say wants, I mean wants in the category of comforts, because you kind of need them in a way, but you don't really need them to survive. So that's very important. So having comforts and knowing what comforts are, super important. Then you have, for example, like your grocery bill. What do people need to actually have a healthy life? Rice, beans, and some protein, and also, for example, some vegetables, fruits, juice, and stuff like that for the vitamins. And when you think about it, when people say, I went to the store and I spent $500 this month on the groceries, and you look at their fridge, they have Eggos, they have little coffees, and they have little $10 this and $10 that, and they have the little yogurts and whatever. The reason you spend so much money on your groceries is because you probably don't know how to shop. And that's normal because no one teaches us how to actually shop. And one thing I've learned by being around my grandma and being around my mom, who raised us on her own, basically, the answer is a responsible woman can actually make money stretch and can actually feed their kids healthy without sacrificing health in a way. And that's very important, to find out what are necessities and what are not. And lastly, transportation. To have a decent vehicle to actually commute in. For example, my grandpa, his all-time commuting vehicle for the past like 7 decades he's been alive has been horses. And whenever he wants to go somewhere else, he has a bus he basically takes, public bus. And am I telling you go buy yourself a horse? Of course I'm not. But I'm telling you, when you actually boil things down to A to B, just that's what a car is, takes you from point A to point B, you don't really need to have that $30,000 SUV you probably think you do. And now, I say this because it's not just about being frugal or being cheap, if you might consider that cheap, but it's about really understanding what things actually cost you as far as life do, okay? So, for example, if I got everything that I wanted, and I got, for example, that $500,000 house that I wanted in New Jersey, and I got that Cayenne Porsche that cost like around $50,000 when I was basically in New York, and I got, for example, those grocery bills of like $500, buying this and buying that, or like $700 on food. And I got, for example, all those utilities, like the best internet, the best this, the best that, and the best this, my expenses would be so much per month that it would be insane. Like I would have to keep working for the next like 3 decades or whatever to be able to finally pay off that home, to be able to finally be done with all these things. And then before you know it, life passes you by. And it's like, well, what do you have to show for it? I have a big house, I have a nice car I've been able to drive, and I have decades and decades that I dedicated to a job or a company or a business. Because by the way, it's not just entrepreneur stuff, and it's not just, for example, like, oh, you're a slave at your job. No, it's everything, It all depends on why you're doing what you're doing. And these days, I decide, no, I rather live like a modest life. And if I was living in the US, I would probably be living in a state where houses don't cost more than like 200 to 300K, Like I wouldn't be trying to live somewhere where because by the way, you put this into perspective. I know people that make $100,000 a year or $120,000 a year, and their rent is like $4,000 a month in Manhattan. And you're like, well, you can make like 70K somewhere else and pay like $1,000 in rent and just have a better life. I like living here, So you really got to consider those things. What are things actually costing you? Not just with money, but in time. And are you really willing to pay that price? And when I actually weighed these things, I just figured I'm not willing to pay that price. at all, you know? So number two is questioning life and asking yourself, you know, what is life really about? And that actually cuts through it cuts through the meat of why I live the way I live. And it's basically, number one, is life about fulfilling every desire you actually have and buying everything you want? You know, that's how they make it seem on the internet, right? Like, you want a big house, go get it. You want a nice car, go get it. If it makes you happy, go get it. You want those clothes, go get it. If you want those shoes, go get it. You know, life is about fulfilling your dreams and having your desires and fulfilling all of them. And it's a very selfish way to actually live, although it might not seem that way, but it really is. And it's a very cheap way to actually live, because that's not what life is really about. And number two is life really about just, for example, buying the things that make you happy? And truth is, it's a very cheap way to be happy, because I don't know about you guys, okay? But there have been a lot of things that I thought that once I had, I was going to be happy. I thought that once I bought, for example, a house and I paid it off in cash, I was going to be happy. Lasted about a minute, then I was done. I thought that maybe when I got my brand new iPhone 14, I was gonna get some happiness. I downgraded, by the way, because when I bought the phone, it was cool for the first maybe like hour, you know. So none of these things, that the happiness factor, none of those things actually last. And you know, is life about, for example, impressing people? You know, I used to buy things, and I might have said, for example, you know, the reason I dress this way, I have the Jordans, I have the nice clothes, is not because I want to impress people, it's because I like it. You know, but then you ask me, well, why don't you buy this H&M shirt that looks exactly the same? Well, you know, it's not the brand I want. Well, because the brand you want is going to impress other people. You know, when you actually crack down to the truth, it is what it is, you know? And these days, I don't even know where this shirt is from. You know what I mean? It's a white shirt, you know what I mean? So it doesn't matter. If you try to live to impress other people, you're never going to be fulfilled, because you can never really fulfill someone else. It's not your job, you know? So that's very important to actually understand. Now, lastly, what were the results when I actually figured this out, okay? When I figured out that life is not about accomplishing my own desires, or life is not about buying things, or life is not about impressing people, it actually showed me that for me, life is about, for example, my values. And for example, being able to pursue those values. And my values are being there for my family, being there for my church, being able to give my life for my faith. And I want to live this way. Because although you might speak this way, and you might say this too, you know, like, I want to live this way, I want to do this, but you don't actually live that way. I really want to live that way, because one big thing I have, and one big problem I have, although I live like a poor person and I'm not spending like a bunch of money or whatever, I also do spend a lot of time on entertainment. And I really want to change that, because the time I could be given to those things I mentioned before, I'm giving it to a computer or to a phone or to a screen, and I don't want to do that anymore. Now, here's a great example. For the man that says that his priority and his value is his family, and the reason he works so hard and neglects his family is because he loves his family, what he's really saying with his actions is, hey, I don't really value my family. I value the things I can give to my family, and I value my work. And that's the truth, you know, it's a tough thing to hear. And I see that a lot, you know, with fathers that they work 10 to 12 hours to try to sustain a household when they could potentially downgrade and work less and be there for their house. It's kind of crazy, right? So it's a radical idea in a radical world, in a sense, but it's the truth. It's the truth. So something to think about. You know, if I lost everything and I had the option between, I can work here and make like 70 grand. Downside is I can only be there for my kids, you know, like maybe like after 6 p.m. and, you know, maybe like to like 6 p.m. to like 8 p.m. or whatever. Or I could work here and make like 40K and then maybe work part-time or whatever. You know, there are ways to do things like that, by the way. Or make like 20K, living here, for example, and be able to be there for my kids more and my wife more. I'd rather that, although I might not be able to have the fancy house and all those other things, okay? That's very important. Now, lastly, guys, on reflecting and everything I said, there is one question, you know. My lifestyle these days, I spend about $1,600. I know my necessities are about $924, and I could still cut some things out. And I was able to fulfill my my childhood dreams in a way of like being a YouTuber and all these things. And one question that I keep having is, you know, where did that dream come from? And why, hear this out because you're never going to hear this in probably like another video again, is going to be, you know, where do those ideas come from? And why did I value the opinion of a child so much? A child who didn't know what life was about, didn't know where anything about history, didn't know anything about raising a family, didn't know anything about those things, you know, but why did I value that so much? And where did the idea come from that if you wanted to do something when you were a kid, you should be chasing that and trying to achieve that, okay? Even if it cost you hours upon hours upon hours, you know? I don't know where that came from. And I think it's a very new idea to people to actually be giving their lives in a way to like a career or to a dream or something like that that can easily just replace them in the market. I think it's very important to actually reflect on and to think about. These days, I do YouTube. I enjoy YouTube. It's great stuff. But the main reason I'm here is to kind of like, you know, share something with you guys and share something of value, hopefully. And it also gives me money to be able to sustain the lifestyle that I have these days, which is not a lot, okay? But it's why I'm here for the sense. But that's very important to actually ask, you know, why exactly do I live the way I live? And why did I want what I want? And why do I, as a grown person now, value that so much? That's it, guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.